Well, Katherine Newman wrote a book several years ago about she and some co-authors taking us inside two of the most notorious school shootings of the 1990s in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and Paducah, Kentucky. And Katherine, I want to thank you for being with us. The book is called Rampage: The Social Roots of School Shootings. Tell us what that. Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for this book and all of the research, a couple of years worth that went into it. What is the social roots of school shootings? What does that mean to us?
It means that it's not just a set of psychological issues that drive a shooter toward these heinous acts, but a set of social circumstances in peer groups, in communities that help, unfortunately, to create the conditions that produce a psychological outburst of this kind. But it's very social. It has to do with how kids, unfortunately, often ostracize, kids who are oddball in some way, that then drives them to want to seek another kind of identity that's not that of a loser who's unable to get into friendship groups, but a notorious, dangerous anti-hero. And that is a lot of the time what drives these shooters. But that's a social situation, not just a psychological one.
Okay, and you say to us that we typify a lot of these individuals as loners, but they're more failed joiners.
Exactly. The experience of the shooters we studied was not one of people absenting themselves and pulling away from social contact. It was the opposite. Kids who were driving toward inclusion, always trying to get inside cliques and never succeeding, constantly being rebuffed, rejected, turned away, until the day they start talking about shooting people. And then the dynamic starts to change, and unfortunately, kids start paying attention to them, and it starts building up a sense of commitment to a terrible act in order to prove they mean it, and that this attention is warranted. It's a terrible, terrible dynamic, a cocktail of dynamics, but there it is.
The family-friendly nature of the towns that you looked at and the ones that end up, where these events occur, is there a certain pattern there too?
Yes, unfortunately, the predominant pattern in the United States is exactly as we saw last week in Connecticut. They tend to be small, rural towns. There's a secondary pattern in suburbs, as was true in Columbine. We never see this kind of rampage shooting in schools in big cities, where we have a lot more gun violence or background violence, but we don't have this kind of incident. And I think that's not an accident, unfortunately. The school is the only stage in small towns. It's the place where a killer who wants to become notorious and get the attention he's been lacking all these years can attack the whole community, and that's why it happens in schools in small towns and rural areas. Most of the places we studied were places Americans have never heard of before, and there's a reason. They're tiny little towns that are a long way from big cities.
Yeah, the Jonesboro, Arkansas, and Paducah, Kentucky that you looked at, I mean, you spent years talking to individuals there trying to ferret this out. And how widely has your research, I mean, the book Rampage certainly is available, but is it shared and understood, or have we just not taken any of these cues or any of these events seriously? Because you remind us that these are not spontaneous events. These are things that have been building up over periods of time. How easy, though, is it for us to detect somebody who might, be pushed aside by their peer groups and the like, but who would act out in this way? Is that the difficult linkage?
It is almost impossible to predict who will become a shooter of this kind. Even the Secret Service, which is in the business of trying to predict very rare events, gave up trying to predict who would do this. But we do know that they share certain kinds of characteristics, just not enough for us to pinpoint the particular person who's likely to do something like this. This is why I think it's not worth our time to try and engage in this sort of prediction. We do need to pay attention to the mental health needs of young adolescents, because not only because it might help us find this kind of very disturbed individual, but they are the tip of a much bigger iceberg of teenage depression that has been growing in the United States, and hence anything we put into treatment helps millions of kids, not just the very tiny number of people who might do something so terrible. But I think as well we have to understand that we're not likely to be able to spot all these people. They're really, really hard to find. So what we have to do instead is find ways to intercept the information that does circulate about their intentions. And that was, I think, the most surprising thing my research team found. There was evidence very murky evidence, but evidence nonetheless, of plotting and planning as long as 9 months in advance of these events. And there were kids who knew at some level that something horrible was going to happen, but they never told anybody who was in a position to do something about it. They didn't tell the adults in their world. And so a large part of what we wanted to figure out was why kids don't tell when they hear things that scare them. They have a sixth sense that something scary could happen. We had kids in the Paducah case who did not come to school that Monday. And could they have said exactly what was going to happen? No, but something scared them enough that they didn't come to school. But if you ask, did they tell any adults that they were afraid? The answer was no. And so we tried to understand why they don't come forward and what we could do to encourage them to come forward. And the book spends 400 pages trying to explain that. There are things we can do. Would it have helped in the case of this horrible shooting in Connecticut? We don't know enough about this shooter to tell. We don't know enough about who he communicated with, what kind of social structure he was embedded in or not. But in the other shootings we looked at, there were intervention points that might have been possible if kids had felt more comfortable coming forward to adults.
Okay, now, some of the kids that he might have been speaking to online, because it seemed as if his circle, locally, was not terribly great. A 20-year-old living at home, not going to college, I guess, kind of in their own isolation. I guess a lot of his contacts might have been online. They might have been other disconnected kids who were, had been rejected by other peer groups where they had to, in a tactile sense, get to know each other. So they went online and got the comfort there. Is that what they're looking for when they're looking at these computer records, if he hasn't destroyed them or hadn't destroyed them?
I'm sure it is what they're looking for. And, of course, we have a very difficult time surveilling the online or social media system. It's just enormous. But especially in recent years, that is exactly what we are starting to see. So, for example, there was a terrible, devastating shooting on a Native American reservation way up in the northern part of Wisconsin, as I recall, where the young man in question had posted a very artful but extremely violent animated film that he made that showed shootings that were just horrendous. Thousands of people saw that film on a website, and nobody ever was able to put together two and two and realize this was someone who had murderous intentions, and there were 12 people dead at the end of the day. So we really need to think about what we can do to keep our eyes on this vast, vast world of the social media. But there's no question that young kids who feel, and even older adolescents like this one, who feel like they have no friends, no social connections in their immediate neighborhood, are increasingly turning to the web world.
Now, what about his brother? They brought him in. Of course, he lives in New Jersey, the father. There was obviously something that had gone on in this family. One went with the father, the other with the mother. And, of course, the mother having access to guns, she perhaps living in some isolation in that community. They said that as much as she would go down to a bar and talk to a lot of folks and play dice and so forth, every time it came her turn to have people over to her home, she never invited them in. There was always a pass on anybody coming into the Lanza home. So there was something going on there I wonder, what do you think about the ability, and with all the interviews that you've done, for parents who may detect that there's something wrong? Do they not want to admit that their child needs more help? Do they need them to be dependent upon them? What are the issues that go on often with the adults in their lives?
Yes, this is highly complicated, and of course we need to learn a lot more, so this is speculating based on what I know of other cases. But we do see that especially young people who are in the early stages of severe mental illness are very aware that something's going wrong. They know something's wrong. One of the shooters we studied was afraid to walk on the floor. He would jump from one piece of furniture to another because he thought there were demons on the floor. It's the kind of thing that all of us who are parents have heard 3-year-olds say, Mommy, there's a bear in the closet. But he had this extraordinary sense of fear about things around him. Did his parents know this? Not really. These are the things we learned in forensic interviews after the fact. The early stages of severe mental illness are not that easy to detect in a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old. By the time you get to someone who's the age of the shooter at Virginia Tech, someone who's in their 20s, the symptoms now become much more recognizable to the psychiatric profession. But the early onset of these truly disturbing diseases is not so easy to detect. So parents do need to be sensitive to their children if they're withdrawing, if they're having difficulty with peers. But, of course, there are millions of kids who are like that, and so you end up with millions of false positives in order to find the tiny handful of people who are going off the deep end. But they often go off rather quietly and inconspicuously in ways that are difficult for parents to recognize. That said, in the communities we studied, these shooters were often known by others as troubling. We had, I will never forget my interview with a psychiatric nurse. Psychiatric nurses are trained to identify these behaviors. A psychiatric nurse who drove her daughter to school rather than let her sit on the bus near one of the people who ended up being a killer, because he scared her. Did that mother ever go to the parents of that boy and say, your son, he's shooting cats with BB guns in the background. He is starving animals in the backyard. What are you doing anything to help him? This is a psychiatric nurse. She avoided it. She just avoided it because conflict between adults in small towns is also very difficult to withstand. So there's a whole dynamic around the adult relations and the things that adults reinforce in school pecking orders that make the ostracism more difficult for kids to handle. It's a very complex social situation, but one which we do think is not only understandable, but it's possible to intervene and make a difference.
Now, this may be unfair, but some of the things that you mentioned about, doing harm to animals and so forth, we've had people on here who have profiled serial killers, and they exhibit some of the same things. The question is, what creates, if it's not a spontaneous thing, it's something that has been building over a period of time, so many factors and many people recognizing traits that concern them, but never really putting it all together or deciding to take action or even to confront another parent whose child it may be. What's the difference between perhaps somebody who takes it out in a serial killing way versus this mass execution that went on here in Connecticut?
I think I am not an expert in these kinds of psychological disorders, so you may want to talk to psychiatrists about it. But I would guess, based on what I've learned, that a killer who goes out as this one did, is looking for a kind of blaze of anti-hero, suicidal glory. They are very fixated on how this act is going to change the way people think about them. The serial killer is a stealth figure who gets a certain kind of pleasure out of fooling people over a long period of time. It's more of a cat and mouse kind of game. And I do think those are slightly different psychological dynamics. In the case of the shooters we studied for whom this terrible blaze was what they were looking for, they imagine how they will be thought of later. Mm-hmm. Very often they realize they're going to die in the process, and in fact they're looking for a way to commit suicide. But they're not just committing suicide or they just take themselves out. They're looking to commit suicide in a way that will shift their social image to one of notoriety and sort of regnant evil, rather than the kind of cat and mouse where they're fooling people over a long period of time and taking a certain delight in seeing how society reels at the hands of someone who's outwitting them.
Interesting. And what about the fact that the mother was killed first? I had read or heard where at times that is the opening salvo, in the sense that it says, well, I've already gone this far, killed my own mother. Yeah. Now nothing can really, stop me. Is that something that happened in any other cases or no?
Yes, it's happened in a number of other cases. There was a terrible case in Oregon, Kip Kingle, a number of years ago, who killed his parents and then went to his school and killed many people thereafter. The case I mentioned to you before on the Indian reservation way up north also killed his grandparents and then went on a killing spree in the school. So I think you're right. It, tragically often begins with an assault that's just unthinkable, and then it just unleashes, because there are no holds barred at that point. You've already broken through
any taboo. Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you what, Neil, I believe, wants to ask you a question, then I'll let you go. I know you've been so generous with your time. Katherine Newman, the book is called Rampage. Neil, what do you have?
Yeah, Katherine, fascinating. you've made more sense than anybody else I've heard so far, by far.
Thank you.
May I just ask you, in past history we had what we called the village idiot, and now you've made it painfully clear that now we have the village, in some cases anyway, we have the village anti-hero. And I think you'd agree this all has to do with the dynamics of the village, and that's what's causing these shootings in this type of situation. I'll just listen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
I want to be clear here. The dynamics of the village for 99% of the people who live there are not only positive, but almost gloriously so. That is, if you are in a small town community, there's a reason why people think of Newtown as the most wonderful place to live, because for most people it is. But if you are a marginal person, if you are someone who's having a lot of trouble fitting in, a tight-knit town that's very high in what we call social capital will feel like a death sentence. So when we say it's the dynamics of the town, we have to understand the dynamics of the town for most people are extremely positive. All the interviews we've seen on television with residents who say, I love this community, this is a wonderful place, everyone should know that it's wonderful, they're right. Except for the highly marginal kid on the fringe. And for that kid, the very qualities that make the community wonderful, its stability, its tight-knit nature, the way in which adults are involved in the lives of children, all those things are catastrophically backwards for the marginal child. Because I don't want to label these communities as somehow terrible places. That's completely wrong.
And you're not. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. And we've got a lot of people who listen to talk radio who like to really go out on the margins and sometimes really castigate somebody who doesn't fit their stereotype of normal. And we ostracize lots of individuals, either because of their speech, because of their look, because of their uniqueness on one level or another. And we've got to get a lot more, aware of this and more sensitive. I know certain people think we're already too politically correct, but we are marginalizing a lot of people. Look at the jock mentality that went on, was it in one of your studies?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, see, this is one of the reasons why I think these incidents don't happen in big cities so much, because in a big city, most kids can find a niche somewhere. You know, if you're a really smart boy and you love the classics, you'll find, a theater group or you'll find a chess club. There are more niches to fit in because big cities just have a huge array of possibilities. Small towns tend not to have such huge arrays, and they tend, therefore, to be wonderful places for the kids who are part of the community in the wholest way. But for the kid who's on the edge, it's the opposite. It's a prison to them.
Absolutely. You've made so much sense, as you said. I can't thank you enough. Katherine, Newman, Rampage, the social roots of school shootings. I really appreciate you being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Katherine.
Bye-bye.
And this is an interview that we're likely to replay tomorrow. Let people know that if they haven't been listening today, I should replay this because she is truly, truly remarkable. And I want to thank all my guests today. We'll be back in a moment.